to you shortly. I just want to bring in Ruth Edwards first with some further questions.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are about stop and search in normal time, if you like, so before the COVID-19 pandemic. The latest Home Office statistics show that as a proportion of the population, black people are almost 10 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched. Nick Glynn, in your experience, both in terms of your research and as a former police officer, why, in your view, does this disproportionality exist? And I know that the HM Inspectorate of Constabulary have made some recommendations about how the data set around stop and search can be improved, so we can draw better conclusions why the disproportionality exists. I was wondering what your recommendations would be for improving that data set.
Well, I think the answer is that it's a complex picture, but for sure one of the reasons that disproportionality exists is the structural racism in the system. So you have to look at what are people's views from what they see in the media of Black and Asian people. How are they portrayed? What are the myths around who uses drugs, for instance? So there's some really good research by Release that shows that people across Black, Asian and white communities use drugs at around the same rate. And yet the perception is in society and in policing that that there's a different picture. Those views, those stereotypes influence activity, whether it be overt and discriminatory or whether it be unconscious or unwitting. But the result of those things are the same. And and of course, they are self-perpetuating as well. If an individual has a intelligence that they are suspected of a particular offence, of using drugs, of supplying drugs, whether they were or not, these things can be self-perpetuating, and they connect to their friends and their associates. And so, and I think we've seen this with the gang matrix, which has been widely criticised, that these impressions are created around particular groups, and they have an impact, and they have an impact on policing because they have an impact on where the police do their patrols, who they target, why they target them, and indeed who they are told to target and what kinds of offences they are told to target. All of these things impact on those disproportionality rates, and it's about in recent times. I know you said to sort of look at normal times. Where do the police patrol? Where do they focus their attention? In leafy suburbs or in built-up areas? And Ben mentioned earlier on about people who, feel that they look out of place in a particular environment. And when you look out of place, sometimes you are targeted by the police just because it's, you don't look like you are from around here. All of these things and many other things besides are driving that disproportionality. And as far as the data set is concerned, I think the police can do a much better job. They own this data. It's their information. It's their responsibility to ensure that it's accurate, that it's complete, and that it's not just provided in internal means, but that it's made public so that there can be proper scrutiny and accountability for it.
Thank you. And Miran Gidda, as someone who's spent some time leafing through police FOIs and a former profession myself, I have sympathy for your ordeal this time. From your experience, what do you think can be done to improve stop and search data sets so we can draw more concrete conclusions from them?
I think the point I'd like to make is about the collection of data as a whole from the police. I think what we need is for police forces to drastically improve their collection of ethnicity data, also relevant other factors such as age, I think we need to get to a point where we're not having to rely on officer-defined ethnicity, which often can vary from self-defined ethnicity and may not be completely accurate. And we need to kind of get to a point where the data that's being published is more transparent. It's just going back to the fines, a big problem has been the data that we're getting is analysis done by the NPCC. And without wishing to cast aspersions, they haven't given us the full picture. And they've given us their analysis. It would be so much better if we had the raw data so that people like myself and crucially statisticians could do a full analysis. Because as I said, I think at the start, with Wales, we cannot do sufficient analysis because the NPCC is withholding data from us.
Thank you. And going to Katrina French, if I may. Since August 2019, obviously, we know the government has reduced the level of authorisation needed to conduct no suspicion stop and searches under Section 60. In your role chairing the Mayor of London's Community Monitoring Network, what impact have you noticed on sort of relations between police and Black and minority ethnic communities?
I have to say I relinquished that role in 2018. So
oh, I'm sorry.
No, apologies if I hadn't been clearer, so excuse me for that. But I can speak to what the relationship is like with communities, just in terms of Stopwatch's role in community engagement. And unfortunately, it's regressive, it's not positive, and it's because exactly some of the comments and perceptions that just because, in unquote, there's black on black crime, I would like to say white on white crime exists. We saw it in terms of the right-wing protesters going against police officers. And this framing of the language for young people, they don't believe that the police see them as innocent or just being law-abiding citizens. And when we have Section 60s, where you don't have to have any reasonable grounds, where a police officer can just stop you, and unfortunately they aren't being very clear in how they communicate what's going on. People don't feel they have any trust. Also, they're not communicating to key stakeholders about there being a Section 60 in place. So people are unaware that, you know, police officers can just stop you. And this was one of the things that Sir William Macpherson highlighted, is that the normal Joe Bloggs, you know, Amy Smith, Katrina French on the street is not able to distinguish between Section 60 powers, police powers, Section 23. So it's incumbent on officers to communicate that and to do that in a way that makes people feel it's not me, it's about where my area is. And instead of it being an individual attack, I think there is something about this perception that only young black males are involved in street crime. There are young males involved in street crime of all ethnicities across the country. However, this focus on it being young black men unfortunately emphasizes and makes the police have a more pronounced approach to their policing of that community. We are very disappointed that the government extended the Section 60 pilot with a lack of evidence. And obviously with the pandemic going on, you know, it's kind of shifted to the side, but it's important that the assessments that they were carrying out, that evidence is published, and then we can have a proper conversation around whether Section 60 is effective. I think we have to remember where it came from. It came from football hooliganism. And in that sense, we're able to identify people who are going to be in a specific place at a specific time. We may have intelligence about people that were going to do that. When you zoom out and you start using Section 60 as they did in Birmingham for the whole of the city in 2019, I have very big concerns, because that's over 1 million people potentially going to be drawn in to the criminal justice system. The other thing I'd like to add is when a Section 60 is carried out, it should be for weapons. We know that the actual fine rate is about 2%, as opposed to when you carry out a PACE search for weapons, it's around 14%. So actually, when we get rid of reasonable grounds, we're seeing even less effectiveness in the power, and definitely, it's just speaking frankly, rubbing up people the wrong way. They just feel I'm being targeted. So we have to understand the evidence here isn't supporting Section 60 to be used in the way it is, and that's from the Home Office, it's from the College of Policing, it's also from just qualitative speaking to people. So if we understand that, we have to now take action to ensure that that same policing power isn't being pushed out in a way that undermines the police confidence. Because we all want the police to do a good job, but if you have the wrong tools, we all know you can't do a good job. And I think that's where we are with Section 60 at the moment, is we know it's not working. However, because of political expediency, and I don't want to say it's lazy policing, but when a Section 60 is out, officers don't need to have grounds. They don't necessarily need to use their personal observation skills. It's just there's a section 60 and so I'm going to stop you. And I want to add in that the use of handcuffs is just exponential in London, and that's causing people to not feel they're being policed by consent. And also emergently, plainclothes officers jumping out of a van and just grabbing you as you're on your way to get milk or something and saying, oh, there's a section 60 in place, to maybe a 12-year-old kid who has no idea what a section 60 is. So there's just ways in which it's not only being deployed, it's how it's being used, the length of time it's being used, how it's being communicated, but more importantly, the statistics say it's not effective. So if we have the evidence that says it, please, 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 as elected officials, put some pressure on those that are advocating for a policing power we know to be ineffective to be continually rolled out, because communities do feel oppressed, they don't feel listened to, and it's undermining any public confidence.
Thank you very much. And then my final question, I think, because I know we're running short of time, to Professor Bowling. The Met Police obviously come in for a lot of criticism this morning in their use of stop and search. They would argue, in fact they did argue in 2019, that it's a vital tool which helped them to reduce the murder rate in London by a quarter over the previous year. What is your reaction to that? And how do you think stop and search should be improved in the future to make it a more effective policing tool that all communities can have confidence in?
So the first thing I would say is I would like to see the research evidence on which the claim is made. I would like to see the quantitative data on both homicide sitting alongside the use of the powers, and the causal links between the use of the power and the outcome, particularly given that most instances of homicide, of course, take place in domestic circumstances. This is very widely known and understood, and I fail to see how stop and search can make much of a contribution, if any, to violent crime which happens in private places. I think if we're going to be serious about having a conversation about violent crime reduction, then we need to be thinking about what the evidence is on, proper systematic research evidence on the use of those powers. The government's reviews, the work of the College of Policing, all the scholarly research which has looked systematically at the use of police powers, both those involving reasonable suspicion and the show makes a very limited contribution to crime reduction, if any. I think that the escalation in Section 60, both in terms of the use of the power and its disproportionality, is very, very troubling. I think that I cannot understand why in 21st century Britain a person can be stopped, placed in handcuffs, subject to interrogation on the street without a reason, without reasonable grounds that they have done something that would merit or justify them being stopped. Section 1 of PACE is a power short of arrest to allow a police officer to confirm or allay a reasonable suspicion. And I personally have, if that law is being used properly, have no problem with the idea that a police officer could stop somebody, ask them questions when they have reasonable grounds for thinking that they're involved in crime. They think they're in possession of a weapon, they've got good reasons for that. They believe that they're carrying equipment to carry out crime. Of course, a police officer, in my view, should, where those grounds are clear and can be explained to the person stopped and to a neutral third party, of course, there should be a power rather than arresting somebody. But when, in today's society, people are being stopped and searched without a good reason, this is an anathema. This is, to my mind, and I think it was said at the time of the introduction of this power, and the widespread use of a power that doesn't have grounds, that doesn't have, a police officer doesn't have to give a reason why a person is being searched, I think is an abomination. And it is a total contradiction to British ideas of liberty and justice. And I think that I would echo the point made earlier on by Rosalind. If the power cannot be used properly, lawfully and fairly, as it seems to be the case, then it should be abolished. Section 44 was found to be ultimately useless and just vexatious to the public. If given that Section 60 cannot be used fairly and effectively and in ways that contribute to public safety, it should be repealed from the statute book.
Thank you very much. I think I'm out of time, so I will hand back to the chair.